Imagine Livia Tersa standing at the threshold of her new life. Saffron veil drawn low over braided hair, torches throwing a wavering light across faces, the city's song still ringing in her ears. Her mother's hand trembles on her sleeve. A crowd has accompanied her in procession. The public spectacle has done its work. Names announced, guards invoked, the father's words given. But as the torchlight pushes back the darkness of the house, there is one object, hidden beneath a cloth in the corner of the chamber, that turns the night into something else entirely. What really happened on wedding nights in ancient Rome? That question, promised in the title, has a sharper edge than most of the ceremony's visible trappings. The saffron veil, the cakes, the walnuts. For many Romans, the wedding night was not simply private passion or the intimate consummation of love. It was a legal hinge. Marriage in Roman terms was a transfer of legal authority, manus, over a daughter, and her capacity to produce legitimate heirs. To secure that transfer, law and ritual stepped inside the bedroom. The rest of this piece will walk through a reconstructed wedding night, the legal logic behind it, the textual and material traces we use to understand it, and finally why the practice was gradually suppressed and nearly erased from later memory. If you're intrigued by hidden rituals of the past and want more episodes like this, please subscribe and hit like. There's a lot more beneath the surface of the rituals you think you know. Morning had come earlier for Livia than for most of the house. The women gathered her hair into the official braids. The flame-colored veil, the flammeum, was adjusted so that it fell across her face. Its color and texture marked more than fashion. It was first a public sign. Matrons and neighbors chanted the customary songs. The fesinae, bawdy improvisations that could make a woman blush, were part of the sanctioned noise. There was a moment on the doorstep when her father spoke the formal words that bound her fate to another man's household. In some ceremonies, the bride passed into her husband's manus in a symbolic sale. In others, through a sacred cake shared before the vestal fire. In others, by simply entering and staying in her husband's home for a year. These are the legal forms, confariatio, coemptio, usus, that structured Roman marriage across social lines, though not every family used the same ritual. The public rites announced the change in status, but they did not, by themselves, settle the question that mattered most in Roman civic life. Were the children to come from this union indisputably the husband's? This is where private ritual and the wedding night intersect. Reconstructed from a variety of fragmentary sources, the sequence that many scholars accept as typical, at least among wealthier households, moves from public ceremony into a tightly managed private verification. The procession arrives. The pronuba, a married matron who functions as a ritual escort, takes Livia by the hand and leads her into the room. The household slaves close the doors, but not entirely. Light is left burning in the corridor. In a corner station, a cloth-draped wooden object sits, an emblem tied to Mutunus Tutunus, a fertility figure whose cult survives in a few scattered references. The pronuba instructs. Ritualized gestures follow. The bride approaches and performs a formal greeting to the sacred object, brief, stylized, constrained. Slaves bath her. A physician or midwife may be present to examine her body and record what can be recorded. Later, witnesses, slaves, guests, close kin, attest that the necessary acts took place. Dawn brings a final inspection, and with it sworn testimony that transforms a domestic moment into juridical fact. A few quick caveats are necessary here. This reconstruction stitches together legal texts, passing comments by satirists and moralists, medical treatises, and the condemnations of Christian authors. The result is provisional. Some elements, whether there was a wooden phallus in every household, how often a physician was called, vary across time, place, and class. What the evidence does indicate, however, is a recurring social logic. The verification of sexual status, and the confirmation of consummation were, for many Romans, not private bodily experiences alone, but moves in a legal choreography that protected property and lineage. To understand why, we need to step back into Roman legal thinking. Marriage was less about romantic union than about continuity of line, name, property. The paterfamilias controlled family property, and the father's authority could, in some forms of marriage, pass to the husband. Roman law was obsessed with certainty. Who would inherit? Who could claim legitimate descent? Legitimate heirs required unambiguous parentage. In this framework, a woman's body became a site of evidentiary certainty. If signs of prior sexual activity, or the absence of a verifiable consummation, could be claimed, then the legitimacy of children and the rights attached to them could be contested. Rituals that verified virginity or consummation offered witnesses and sometimes a medical record that could be cited in legal disputes. That's the core of the matter. The rites performed on the wedding night had a public, juridical function, ensuring an orderly succession of property and status. Let's return to Livia's night, and to the figure under cloth. Mutunus Tutunus is a name that keeps appearing in the sources, usually in passing. He is a fertility deity associated with a wooden phallic effigy. The shrine, some sources imply, was a spot where young men might perform a ritual greeting that symbolized sexual readiness. Christian writers who came later seized on such images to denounce pagan immorality. But pagan legal practice and religious custom can be related while not being identical. In the context of a wedding night ritual, the wooden figure's role appears to be symbolic and procedural, an object that formalizes a woman's entry into a new sexual status in front of household authority. The pronuba's direction, she who stands in for the community's approval, turns the act into a witnessed theatricality, and witness is what the law required. What actually happened at that encounter with the wooden figure? Here we must be careful. Ancient sources are rarely explicit, and modern retellings are tempted to fill gaps with lurid detail. The safest and most respectful reconstruction is clinical and ritualized. A formalized greeting, a brief contact or gesture that marks the bride's readiness to take up her role as wife. Scholars suggest that this ritual could involve kissing or touching the object as a sign, not an extended sexual act. That single ritualized gesture could be read by witnesses as evidence that the bride had assumed the marital role. In some elite households, physicians were then asked to provide a more technical form of confirmation. Medical writers of the Roman world, Soranus of Ephesus in the 2nd century, Celsus earlier, and assorted vocational midwives whose texts survive in fragments, offer clues about how surgeons and midwives thought about virginity and the body. Their observations are clinical, often framed around signs such as bleeding or the state of the hymen, which they treated as indicators of previous intercourse. Modern scholars rightly flag the unreliability of such signs. Bleeding is neither universal nor decisive, and the physical markers they describe are subject to misinterpretation. Yet in a world without genetic tests, these physical cues were treated as forensic evidence. A physician's testimony, especially in a wealthy family where contested inheritance was possible, could tip a dispute toward one party or another. So, in Livia's house, the night proceeds. After the brief ritual, household servants bathe the bride, washing the traces of procession away. She may be left with a lamp burning in the corridor. The door might remain partly open, or at least it is known who will stand within earshot. The pronuba, veteran of other marriages, remains in attendance. The husband and wife share the bed, but not in the privacy we assume. In some reconstructions, the consummation is supervised, not a continuous presence inside the bed, but a legal arrangement whereby witnesses can later swear that the required gesture of consummation occurred. Those witnesses, slaves or family members, could therefore attest to the husband's marital rights. At dawn, The physician might perform a short inspection, or a sworn statement could be recorded in the presence of a small group. This is the legal hinge, whether the husband can claim his wife-in-law and whether any future children are his under established rules of inheritance. You might ask, was this ritual universal? No, variations are everywhere. Lower-class marriages often function differently, more loosely, or simply without medical inspection. Political and regional variations mattered. The dramatic scenes we reconstruct from elite households do not map neatly onto the realities of all Roman women. That said, in elite circles where estates, names, and power were at stake, rituals to secure legitimacy were more elaborate and more likely to involve physicians, sworn witnesses, and symbolic objects. The textual record that informs this reconstruction is a patchwork, and its biases shape our interpretations. Christian authors such as Augustine, late 4th, early 5th century, and Arnobius, late 3rd, early 4th century, denounced the sexualized aspects of pagan ritual in rhetorical terms designed to shock or to prove a moral point. Augustine, writing from a Christian theological framework, condemned pagan obscene rites as part of a broader attack on Roman religion. Arnobius and Lactantius similarly used descriptions of sexualized festivals and objects to illustrate pagan depravity. These writers had agendas. Condemning and discrediting the previous religious order helped justify Christian ascendancy. Their accounts are valuable for showing that such practices were known and controversial, but they must be read with the awareness that polemic often amplifies or simplifies. On the pagan side, legal texts and writers like Varro, 1st century BCE, give us more procedural insight into marriage's legal categories, though for Varro and his contemporaries, the emphasis is often on the social and legal formulae rather than on bedroom detail. Satirical poets and playwrights, the same voices that produced the Fesinae, occasionally hint at sexual customs without providing systematic description. Archaeology contributes a third strand of evidence. Statuettes, votive offerings, and certain frescoes depict phallic symbols and fertility imagery. These objects are suggestive, but not definitive. Archaeologists rightly warn that the presence of a phallus in a household shrine does not prove the precise rituals we are reconstructing. Visually, sexuality and fertility were embedded in Roman art and religion. Whether those images were literally enacted in every marriage remains contested. Part of the reason the ritual seems so foreign and shocking today is that modern notions of privacy, personal bodily autonomy, and the sacralization of romantic marriage have shifted. In Rome, marriage was as much a public, social, and legal matter as an intimate relationship. The body could be evidence. The husband's ability to prove his claim to heirs was a communal concern. That does not sanitize the experience of brides like Livia. Imagine the pressure, the glare of ritual, the knowledge that your body could be treated as a document in a potential future dispute about children and property. Modern viewers rightly find this distressing. Yet, anachronistic moralizing that simply condemns without context risks obscuring why these acts were performed and why they were meaningful within Roman social logic. The pronuba is a key figure here precisely because she embodies the community's participation. She is not neutral. Her presence sanctioned the bride's transition, and her testimony carried weight. In some households, she might be a maternal figure. In others, an agent of the patriarchal household. The pronuba's function illustrates how rituals distribute responsibility. Authorization does not rest on private consent alone, but on public acknowledgement. What about resistance or agency? We must avoid flattening Livia into passivity. Agency in the ancient world rarely conforms to modern categories. Some women might have navigated these rituals with pragmatic acceptance, finding social advantage in marriage alliances. Others could and did resist. Disputes over marriage, claims of rape, and contested paternity appear in legal records. Roman law did provide certain protections and channels for complaint, though they were often limited and asymmetrically applied. In court, testimony mattered. So did status. A woman's options in asserting her interests were conditioned by class, family connections, and the particular legal form of her marriage. Scientific and historiographical questions complicate any neat picture. Did physicians really keep records that could be produced in court? In elite cases, the presence of literate household staff and the practice of keeping documents make it plausible that some medical testimony was recorded and could be invoked later. The surviving medical literature suggests that doctors were consulted in matters of female health and fertility, and in some cases their professional opinion would be enlisted in disputes. But the scale and frequency of such practice remain debated. Why did such rituals decline? The answer is multi-layered. As Christianity gained cultural and legal weight from the 4th century onward, new conceptions of marriage emerged. The Church increasingly framed marriage as a sacrament centered on the private union of spouses before God, shifting emphasis away from public transfer of authority and towards spiritual unity. Christian authors condemned pagan eroticized practices, and ecclesiastical legislation gradually changed matrimonial law to align with Christian doctrine. At the same time, Roman legal institutions evolved, changing understandings of personhood, inheritance rules, and the growing role of written documentation altered how legitimacy and succession were managed. Practices that seemed unbecoming to Christian sensibilities were suppressed or simply fell out of favor. Importantly, Christian denunciations also had an erasing effect. Polemical accounts often became the only surviving narrations of some rituals, and later readers read these condemnations as documentary evidence rather than rhetorical attack. The result was a double sort of disappearance. Physical practices faded, and memory of them was reshaped by the voices that remained. Yet elements persisted in altered forms. Folk customs, saffron veils, nuts, certain songs survived because they had different social functions as symbols rather than evidentiary procedures. People continued to mark marriage publicly. The sacramental framing did not abolish social celebration. What shifted was the degree to which the body itself was used as juridical evidence of legitimacy. Returning to Livia, what does the night mean for her life? If the ritual's function was to ensure a smooth legal succession, it still carried consequences for personal status. A successful verification would clear the way for recognized children, secure alliances, and protect inheritance. Failure, or disputed verification, could scandalize a family, undermine a spouse's claims, and tether women to contested reputations. There are recorded legal cases where the question of virginity or prior intercourse becomes the center of litigation, with reputations and fortunes at stake. These cases remind us that the ritual was not merely ceremonial. It intersected with real stakes. Throughout this reconstruction, historians have to balance empathy with critical distance. We can feel horror at the idea that bodies were treated as proof objects, and we can also try to understand how and why both men and women might have accepted or perpetuated such systems. Scholars today bring different interpretive lenses. Legal history highlights procedural logic, gender studies foregrounds power dynamics and bodily autonomy. Cultural anthropology points to the ritual's role in binding communities. Archaeology brings material context. Put together, these perspectives show that Roman wedding nights were not a single, uniform practice, but a cluster of intersecting acts that made family continuity visible and provable. The primary sources that mention these practices must be treated carefully. Augustine's denunciations carry Christian moral aims. Arnobius and Lactantius are similarly rhetorical. Varro's legal and antiquarian fragments provide structural categories for marriage, but not the intimate choreography of the night. Medical treatises, Soranus, Celsus, and the genre of gynecological manuals offer clinical language that later legal actors could use, even if the science was flawed. Archaeological finds, phallic amulets, votive carvings, and iconography supply visual evidence that fertility symbolisms were present in the cultural landscape, but do not map neatly onto a specific domestic rite. Scholars therefore speak in probabilities and options. The evidence indicates a ritualized verification existed in some contexts, served particular legal uses, and varied over time and class. One final point about memory and erasure. Popular imagination tends to keep the visible, colorful elements of Roman weddings, the veil, the songs, because they are easy to depict and commemorate. The more juridical, invasive, and embarrassing practices were easier for later Christian moralists to excise from idealized memory and for subsequent generations to deny or reframe. In that sense, the very shock modern audiences feel at reconstructions like Livia's is partly an artifact of historical forgetting. So what really happened on wedding nights in ancient Rome? The sober answer is this. Public ceremony marked the social transfer of a woman's status. Behind that public stage, select rituals, some symbolic, some clinical, functioned to provide legal proof that the marriage could produce legitimate heirs. Those rituals included ritualized greetings to fertility objects like the mutunus tutunus figure, supervised consummation in certain contexts, and, where stakes required, the testimony of physicians and witnesses. The practices varied significantly across social strata. Our knowledge is fragmentary and inflected by sources with agendas, so historians reconstruct rather than narrate with certainty. But the broad pattern is clear. For many Romans, a wedding night could be as much about evidentiary closure for a household as it was about private union. Livia's story ends, in the reconstruction, with dawn. The witnesses, the pronuba, perhaps a physician, have confirmed what they could. The household adjusts to its new legal reality. For Livia, life proceeds within the contours of her marriage. She might exercise forms of influence inside the household, or she might find herself constrained by the legal architecture that defined her role. Either way, the rites that welcomed her into marriage were designed to make lineage legible and transmissible. What does that mean for us today? The spectacle of a wedding night as legal proof challenges modern assumptions about intimacy, privacy, and bodily autonomy. It forces a confrontation with the fact that law and ritual have not always been separate from the most intimate human acts. It also suggests caution in how we remember the past. Sensational stories can obscure the nuanced social logics that made such rituals meaningful to their contemporaries. If this peel back of ancient domestic life surprised you, tell us in the comments, which part of Livia's night struck you most? Do you see echoes of these tensions in modern legal or cultural debates about privacy and the body? Share this with someone who loves hidden histories, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more deep dives into how law, ritual, and everyday life intersected in the ancient world. What happened on wedding nights in ancient Rome was not uniform, and it was often unsettling. But understanding the rituals that stood behind the public pageantry helps explain why the Roman family looked and behaved the way it did. It helps us see that when torches were lowered and the cloth was lifted, what unfolded was both personal and profoundly public, a rite meant to make the future legible, enforceable, and, in the eyes of the law, certain.